Good morning, everyone. My name is Sri Raj. I'm serving as the co-chair for the Urban Forum this year. I also serve as the director of the Urban Transportation Center at UIC. Welcome, one and all, to being here, for taking time out of your schedules. And at this time, as I'm talking, I see the panel moving in, and it's the private sector entities that are going to come here and ask us a very important question, whether we are ready to buy an autonomous vehicle. And in doing that and helping us navigate that list of questions, we have Jerry Quant, who is the executive director of the Illinois Autonomous Vehicle Association, who has very kindly agreed to moderate this session and has played a huge role in roping these fine folks here to UIC. And so thank you, Jerry, and then I'll let you take over and then walk through the next session.
Fantastic. Autonomous vehicles. Wow, those are two packed words, right? Excitement, anxiety, hopefulness, fear. All of those come rushing into us when we hear about this topic. And these emotions come with any change. It's what we're kind of enduring right now is we're in the midst of that change. Technology is enabling the disruption of a core element of our society, how things move around, how people move around. That impacts us on such a visceral level. My hope for the panel today is that we set the stage for what's going to be necessary to make this revolution happen in a positive way. The hope it can bring and the excitement it can inspire, excitement that will be inspired from this. We also hope to inform you through our panelists, who are expert practitioners, how they're focused on things and quelling the fears that people might have. So let's kick this discussion off with a simple premise, and you kind of heard it in Finch's remarks, is that the simple premise of automating mobility is about two things: driving safety and increasing efficiencies. So with that, we have a great panel of experts. To my immediate left is Joe Buckner, the Director of Product Engineering for a company called Autonomous Stuff. Autonomous Stuff is one of the premier leaders of innovating the development of automated systems within vehicles. You probably haven't heard of them, but they do a ton of work and have been doing a ton of work for a multitude of years. And they're right here in our home state in Morton, Illinois, which is just outside of Peoria. So welcome, Joe. Next to Joe, we have Beth Bond, who's the head of city development from Bosch. I don't know how many of you know, Bosch is a privately owned company, and it's actually owned by a non-for-profit. Their focus is around truly the development of a lot of gadgets. What most of you don't know is if you have a cell phone in your pocket, there's a pretty good chance there's a Bosch component in that cell phone. Because mostly we know Bosch for what? Power tools, automotive parts supplier, and making dishwashers. Right? But the reality is their devices are in a multitude of things, and they have a focus on connecting all of those things and all of their sensors and devices. So welcome, Beth, to talk about that.
Better myself.
Next to Beth, we have Don DeLoach, who's the co-founder and CEO of Rocket Wagon Venture Studios. This is a newly formed venture studio that's really all about building and enabling new technologies to flourish around communications, security, and really foster that development. I'm never going to do justice to what you guys do because you do so many really out there things and good things. Next to Don, we have Jimmy Lanigan. Jimmy is the Director of Economic Development for MyJack Products and Lanco International. If any of you guys have ever been to a port before and you've seen those big cranes that lift containers off of a train and put them on the back of a truck, that's what MyJack does. And we'll talk a little bit, he'll be here to talk a little bit more about that. And Dan Zakula, who's the Vice President of Technology and Business Development for MyJack Products as well. So let's go down the line here really quickly. Joe, I think you're probably one of the greatest people to kick this conversation off and really talk to us from a practitioner's level about where we're at with the evolution of automation and help dispel the myths about really what's going to be possible in the next 3 to 5 years and really what's more of a decade off.
Sure.
Well, I think what's really unique about my perspective and the company that I work in, right? While you may not have heard of autonomous stuff, you've definitely heard of our customers, right? And so pretty much anybody and everybody in this industry, right, who's working on autonomous vehicles, we've had the opportunity to at least talk to some of their engineering team, right? Understand and kind of peek behind the curtain a little bit and really truly get a feel for where this technology is. And what's interesting, right? You heard Finch talk about in the next decade, right, is whenever we think some of these autonomous vehicles will actually hit the road. I personally share that opinion. So in the next 3 to 5 years, right, what are the types of things that we're going to see? Well, the fact that we have, 37,000 people a year die in automobile accidents is absolutely unacceptable, right? It's the thing that gets me out of bed every day and come to work and be excited about creating this autonomous technology and helping all these other customers, enabling them to drive forward the autonomous technology that they're working on. So what is it that we have today, right? We have Tesla Highway Autopilot, right, which people are too comfortable with whenever they sit behind the wheel. There's nothing wrong with the technology. It's great, right? It will save people's lives, but when people get too comfortable, people unfortunately die and they have accidents. And that's one of the challenges with the, what people talk about level 3 automation or semi-autonomous vehicles, where they have lots of autonomous functionality, but it's not fully autonomous. So the consumer feels like they can let go of control, right? I've sat in a lot of these vehicles, whether it's a large mining truck on a mine site somewhere in Australia or, running around on the streets of Peoria, Illinois, in one of our vehicles that we're running, open source autonomous software on. It's absolutely incredible to see how easily a human can become complacent in those scenarios. And so in the next 3 to 5 years, we need to see a lot of training, right, around what are these systems capable of, a lot of education, right, that autonomy isn't here yet. It's not here today, right? And even if a decade from now we have autonomous vehicles available for purchase, you still have the migration of that throughout the rest of the industry, right? The adoption of technology in cars. People are owning cars for longer than they ever have before. And so we're looking at a 30 to 40 year time frame before new technology like adaptive cruise control is going to reach the breadth of everybody in this room. And whenever I think about that, that's absolutely crazy, right? And we're seeing these ads and people are saying autonomous cars are here and it's going to be here tomorrow. And the reality is there's a long runway for this transition to happen. And that's, I think, a good point to stop and let some other folks hop in and discuss the next topics.
Sure. Jimmy and Dan, this is for you guys because it's not just about movement of people. It's also about movement of goods. So talk to me, moving of shipping containers and heavy products and heavy lift things can be kind of treacherous work and also inefficient at times. Can you talk to me about how MyJack is using applied technologies to improve safety and efficiency within the environments you guys operate in?
Sure. One of the things with handling cargo is there are a lot of disciplines of personnel working in a facility. So you have truckers that are moving containers and chassis and trailers around inside a facility. You have cranes that are lifting cargo to and from trains or in and out of storage stacks. There are personnel people that are driving around in some vehicles, servicing rail cars and things like that, as well as addressing in a rail terminal with double-stack cars. There's connectors that connect the upper and lower level of the containers. So people have to be working in that area all the time to keep the business moving. So there's several different disciplines going on all at the same time, and everybody's concerned about their own particular job, not necessarily the other people's job. So we use technology there to track and communicate movements of typically other vehicles, so that from a lift equipment perspective, any vehicles that are working in the area of the lift, we create work zones, as Finch was mentioning, dynamic work zones that will track that vehicle around the moving lift point on the material handling equipment. And if there's any kind of interaction occurring between them, we'll typically slow down the lift equipment so that loads don't ever get carried over other vehicles or the people on top of them. So in our world, the migration goes from manually operated equipment to semi-automation, where there are some functions of the equipment being managed automatically, but still part of it has to be done by the human being. And then you move towards automation, whereby you can do more activity with some particular types of material handling equipment, but you always have a human monitoring it. And with all of these pieces taking place, the move towards autonomous vehicles is kind of important, but slow moving for us right now.
It sounds to me from both of your comments, and please feel free to jump in on this, that you guys have moved from creating a thing to now having to create a thing that's almost becomes the node on the network, and you really have to start developing a network as well. As you talked about, this vehicle moving, this lift moving things around now needs to be interconnected with other vehicles and potentially other moving things, pedestrians, workers who are in that environment. Talk a little bit to us about that shift in mindset for an organization like yours who have traditionally built that, and then sort of your take on it. You guys aren't necessarily automakers, but I know you come out of Caterpillar, who's been doing this for 35 years. So give us a little feel for what that shift is in the mindset of people who are producing these vehicles.
Well, I'd like to jump in on that a little bit. And we're in a unique position, being a privately held company. And for 65 years, we've really been customer driven. And really, Dan can kind of add to this, is that really our growth in our technologies and our applied sciences and technologies has all been from our customers, from the Class 1 railroads that are coming to us and saying, hey, listen, that's where a lot of the technology we have right now has been used. And I think, of a very good petri dish, of which I think tying all these technologies that already exist. And that's where, being on this panel and Dan really being able to dissect that and be heavily involved, but as a company, as being part of the ownership, it's a great position in which, and I think the transportation and the intermodal industries are really a good start to maybe start looking at these efficiencies. Our founder, my grandfather, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, was looking at this exact type of idea and dream. So as a company, we're really excited to be part of that.
So from I guess my perspective, in the world of connected things and autonomous vehicles and the autonomous industry in general, right, all of those things are absolutely critical to have that level of connectivity with everything that's happening around it. Because once you have control of something, that's great to have a computer control something, but now you need to perceive and understand the world around you. And there's only so much we can do with the autonomous perception technology that's there today. And the way that organizations like Caterpillar have deployed autonomous mining tech, right, on mine sites, is they actually outfit every vehicle, right, that's operating in those areas with communication technology to talk to each other, so that every autonomous vehicle knows where everything else is on that mine site, so that it can be much smarter about it. And in that case, right, the last line of defense is that a perception system detects that something else is there. Right? All of these other technologies and layers of safety should prevent other things from getting in the way of those types of vehicles that are out there operating. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about that is a level of security concern that comes in, which I think we've got some very good people here to talk about this, so I'm not going to go too deep into it, but the reality is, once you have control of something, right, it's a very real risk that someone tries to hack that or takes control, and that's just what happens in this world, right? There are people who are always trying to hack any new technology that comes out in the market.
Beth, that sounds like a perfect segue for you. I mean, Bosch is a very unique position in mobility in the fact that they're the world's largest automotive supplier, and with all of those devices, per your CEO, being connected by
This next year,
2020, so all your devices being connected to the internet in some form or fashion. You guys have moved from a company that builds widgets to a company that not only builds widgets, but connects them all together as well and helps them work to interoperate with one another. So can you talk from a mobility standpoint? You're in a unique position being a part of their city team, which really takes this more holistic look at how all of this integration occurs. Talk a little bit more and expound a little bit more on what Joe was talking about in terms of how all of this connectivity is going to make the entire environment of mobility safer and more efficient.
Yeah, well, I think looking at the different acceptance rates across the different regions that our city teams are in. So we're here in North America, we're in Europe, you're in Southeast Asia. So looking at kind of technology acceptance and readiness is very interesting because, of course, here we look at, of course, we want to address safety as an issue and making sure mobility is deployed in the right sort of way. But also we're very driven by convenience here in North America. Whereas in Europe, it's all about privacy and security and making sure everybody's data is anonymized and aggregated in such a way where it's GDPR compliant. Southeast Asia, it's all about making sure that the billions of people that they have equitable access to a system. So it's interesting to see how the different regions are looking at deploying technology and where that brings kind of the time for deployment for different areas. But certainly, as a connected company, the huge horizon that the Jetsons promised us, I can get home after taking my autonomous vehicle for a ride, and my oven has already cooked my dinner, and the dishwasher is ready to wash the dishes, right? I think the real barrier there is making sure that in all of the different simulations or actual work that's being done in closed environments right now, we're looking at how data is being generated and unifying, formats and standards so that all of those systems can communicate. I think, security, blockchain is an interesting technology that gives us the ability to make sure that we are recording every single data transaction. But certainly there's a ton of different use cases for all of the connected devices that we have and making sure that they're secure and talking to one another efficiently.
Which is a great segue into Don. So
I thought I could set you up with that.
Don, there's obviously lots of conversation about connectivity and interoperability. And in all the conversations we have, you continuously blow my mind about what are the things that are literally imperative and in front of us. And you have an amazing perspective on the rationale as to why. So without prompting a question too different than that, in this new age of data and sharing and information sharing, what are some of the things that most concern you that we as a ecosystem should be addressing now, and why?
Yeah, sure. First of all, everybody mentions security. That can't be overstated. I'm working on a project with a couple of friends, one of whom has a saying that I love. You hear people say data is the new oil, and that sounds, okay, I'm forward thinking data is the new oil. His view, which I subscribe to, is that it isn't so much important that data is the new oil. It's important that trusted data is the new oxygen. And the point here is that you can live without oil for a while, but you can't live without oxygen. And everything we're talking about, this transformation of the cyber physical world, is predicated on us being able to use every day in every part of our lives where this world is going. That's all based on trusting the underlying systems that we're dealing with. So we have to trust it. I think the study was in 2017, about 40% of the recalls into dealerships to work on cars were a function of software. Now, that was about $3 billion worth of charges to the manufacturers. Why would you make a car come into the dealership for something that you could do over the air? And the reason is they don't trust doing it. They're scared they're going to get hacked. Nobody wants to be the next poster child for vulnerability, especially in the mobility space where the stakes are so high. And so that's a really basic answer. But now let's wander into a little bit more progressive territory and talk about the stuff that should be obvious but isn't. So I'll tell you a quick story. By the way, this answer won't run more than 30 or 40 minutes. and I shouldn't know this information, so I'm not going to reveal the names, but there's a very, very large car manufacturer, has a relationship, as you would expect, with a very, very large rental car agency. They've been doing business for some time. The manufacturer sits down one day with the rental car agency and says, hey, you're a good customer. You buy tons and tons of our cars. We appreciate that relationship. You've probably noticed that over time, we've been instrumenting our cars where they're more and more connected. And that throws off a lot of data, and you use that data. It's to your benefit. So here's an invoice for that data. And the rental car agency said, well, thank you very much. Thanks for stopping by. We're gonna take this back and talk about it, and then we'll circle back with you. So they regrouped. I guess sometime later, they called the car manufacturer, got back together, and they said, that was really insightful. We actually do use a lot of that data, and it's more and more. It's great. And so that data that we use from the cars that we buy from you, we appreciate, but we also collect a lot of that data from the cars that we buy from you, and we give that data back to you, and we think that you use that to be more beneficial in terms of servicing all of your customers, and we're happy to do that, and we think it's part of a good relationship. But here's an invoice for the data that we give back to you. Now, the point of that...
Was it $1 more than?
I shouldn't have heard this whole story in the first place. But the point of the story is that there are massive assumptions being made about who owns the data. Why is that? Why hasn't that been reconciled? And the reason is most people haven't thought that through. And if they haven't thought that through, but we're spending millions and millions and really billions of dollars as we progress in time, what other foundational elements are we not thinking about? When Beth was talking, one of the words she used, which is really critical in the equation, was closed. And what she was talking about was the ecosystem in the home, in the car, and everything. And if you look at the progression of IoT, and Heppelman and Porter wrote this seminal article in Harvard Business Review in 2014 about us going from products to smart connected products, which are what we think of as IoT, to product systems to systems of systems. The progression was natural because when you go from smart connected products to product systems, that's because they don't always work unless they think about each other. So one of the original things was like smart homes and All-Scene Alliance and All-Join, because people were buying smart home products and thinking they were so advanced for getting them, and then they realized that their security system wouldn't talk to their smart door lock or to the lighting system or whatever. And that really wasn't practical. So you saw a progression towards let's authenticate these devices so that they work together. And that's smart. That's a good thing to do. And you're seeing that happen. The other thing that doing that closed system authentication does is it gives you ability to get security better. But here's what it doesn't do. It doesn't reach into the world that we're going to. And when we talk about autonomous vehicles, that's not a closed system. You can't drive down the street in your connected BMW and make sure that you can talk to the garage door at the parking lot or the pedestrian on the side of the street or the construction vehicle or whatever. That's a heterogeneous world. That is a system of systems. And so what are the things that we don't know? Well, how does one device talk to the other device? What data do they share? What data should they share? How do they go about sharing that? Who owns that data? Who has stewardship over that data? These are all questions that have not been reconciled yet. People are starting to think about it. People are starting to think about what kind of technology do we need to deploy in order to do that. So you're seeing an advance in terms of edge technologies that will have the infrastructure in place to accommodate this. But there is a mountain of questions and issues and considerations that need to be worked through as we go down this path. Mathematically speaking, we're going to get there. The rate of change is getting faster and faster, and we'll get there, but it's not a layup. A lot of work has to be done.
Right, and just one additional point there is that this exists alongside cities who are now mandating open data. and committing to make sure that, TNCs or rideshare companies who come through, just last year, the city of Chicago made sure that they were publishing origin and destination points, which was previously closed data. So not only who owns the data, but who can access it for public good.
Yeah, I was just going to follow that up with, have any of you as practitioners run into scenarios in which you've developed something that interconnects only to find out that you've had to scrap that and redevelop something totally new for a different customer? Or whereas if we had created, as to Don's talking about these fundamental things, you actually don't have to recreate every time. And again, that gets to a little level of business efficiencies and cost efficiencies to move this technology forward. Do any of you have experience around that?
I guess in terms of my background with autonomous mining, right, and who owns the data, right? I talked about how there's all this information flying across, right, and how much is in a mining truck whenever it goes and dumps in different locations, right? These companies are getting paid based on how much dirt and ore and everything else that they move, and the concept of who owns that data is something that, at least during my tenure of the program, we still didn't fully have ironed out. But it was definitely a continued topic of discussion, right? And it's not a simple thing. And it's going to get even more complex whenever we start taking into account, right, people's privacy, right? And how much of my data do I really want to allow other people to have access to? So I could envision a world where, your autonomous vehicle that you get into, you have to opt into certain terms and conditions in order to enable certain levels or functionality for that vehicle to have. You have to be able to share that data for this level of functionality. So I guess I haven't seen it necessarily completely scrap a project or anything, but it's definitely been topics of contention, right, for both my past life, and I know some of our customers have had that exact same challenge.
Yeah, I think that we haven't gotten in a situation where you scrap something that you've designed or developed, but every customer that you apply your products to, you share information with them, but you also work with their competitors as well. So in most of those cases, what you do for them, very little of it that they want to do exactly the same way. And their methodology is very different. So you're constantly modifying your products to communicate and connect to each and every customer slightly differently. Some cases it's a little bit more than slightly, but again, everybody uses the data in a different way, and what they want to do with it is different as well.
And Beth, this has got to impact you guys,
Oh, gosh.
mainly because as a company, you're into so many different places that standardization of some of this stuff would be a tremendous help at enabling the technology to move forward faster.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there are tens of thousands of products that are commercialized through Bosch, and we reinvest $12 billion each year in R&D to develop more. So certainly we scrap a ton of work, but it helps inform definitely how we could build new use cases for commercialized products that already exist on the market. So instead of having to completely redesign some air quality sensor for a different use case, we can map the use case and bundle that specific sensor with another component that we make. So efficiencies is where it's at for Bosch, especially going forward, knowing that our core business in automotive supply is changing so drastically because, what is it, in a combustion vehicle, there's over 50,000 parts. In autonomous and electric vehicles, there's around 20. So certainly that affects supply chain and the different products that we sell, but we are looking at new use cases that exist within urban markets because OEMs may not be the number one customer in the future, depending on who kind of takes hold of the market.
Let's talk about that. When we opened up, we talked a lot about safety, and we've touched on safety. And the other piece of automation is efficiencies, and you kind of touched on it a little bit. When we talk about efficiencies, we're not just talking about moving people from one place to the next or moving goods in efficiencies, although that's critical, and I'd love to hear your perspectives on that. But also the efficiencies around carbon emissions, the efficiencies around streamlining things, the efficiencies of giving people time back to do other things. Can you guys talk about your perspectives on sort of where you see efficiencies in the businesses and how that plays out in the world you're in, and the benefits?
Yeah, I guess I can talk to what I've seen, at least from a product development cycle, right, in the history of automating all of the things, right? The first step is make the thing work, right? Make it do what it needs to do, and then make sure that what it's doing is doing so safely before you can actually go out and deploy it, and then figure out how you make it much more efficient. And so, unfortunately, the efficiency piece, at least in the world that I have seen, it's kind of that third major step of, okay, let's make sure that this, say an autonomous vehicle is as safe as it can be, right? Or right, automating a gantry crane in a shipyard. Let's make sure that we can make that as efficient as possible. Make it work first, then make it efficiently do its job, or safely do its job, rather. And that'll mean it'll stop for things that it shouldn't have. And then eventually, you get to the point where let's make that safe, right? Let's make that more efficient, because now you can be much, much smarter than a human because you can be more efficient. And so you can reduce carbon emissions. You can start to get really smart about how we can reduce the overall carbon footprint of all of these machines operating out here in the world.
So I would offer a slightly opposing view, not opposing, but just sort of augmented view of that. And that is, so we're talking about, in every element of this, it's all about cyber-physical transformation. We're talking about the physical world, but we're also talking about the digital world. And an element of efficiency is how data is used across the spectrum of everything we're talking about. If you look in the market today and watch how IoT has evolved, when the market first became, the shiny penny and everybody was all excited about it, what was happening is that product providers, by and large, were saying, I'm putting a product in the market today, but with this IoT stuff, I think we need to get on board. So I'm going to instrument the device, and I'm going to stand up a cloud, and I'm going to gather that information, and I'm going to do predictive maintenance. I'm going to let them know when Bay 3 in the industrial facility is left open or whatever. But what I'm doing is I'm creating a consumption model that's tied to the creation of that data. And that's a silo. And while it seemed cool because we're in 2015 and I can now tell when my low-fat fryer at the McDonald's is going to overheat, the problem with that is that architecturally, that's a banking system in 1968. I'm tying the creation of the data to the consumption of the data. And if I want to model something that is as inefficient as I possibly can get, that's what I'm going to do. So what I have to do is I need to think about how do I instrument products knowing that I want to create an environment where I'm going to separate the creation of the data from the consumption of the data, because while McDonald's might want to use the data, the FDA might want that, FryMaster might want that, it's still the same temperature reading coming off that low-fat fryer. And so as we build products, we think about what does this emerging ecosystem look like? And how do I get maximum leverage? My maximum leverage comes from not only sharing the data within my company, I want to think about what does my ecosystem look like, and who are the other constituencies that need that data in whatever form or fashion. And I want to architect my products and my solutions and my view of the world based on that leverage. And I think that with that, you get the data efficiencies that have all kinds of positive effects.
There's one from a systems perspective that comes out of Columbus. They were awarded, I think, $40 million 2 years ago from the DOT. John was talking a lot about those awards today, and it was incredible, their application, because they led with the one thing that every single person wants to do, which is save babies, right? If we can save a baby, we're fulfilling the mission of humans on Earth. And what they did was they tied a system of transportation that they were to develop to address maternal and prenatal visits for new moms. And so they said, we are going to develop a system that tracks transit times, that tracks the user in the system as they're traveling. And if they're running late on their train or their vehicle or their ride to their appointment, then the appointment will dynamically shift the appointment time to make sure that it doesn't have to be rescheduled, and we can create an efficiency within the system and meet this proactive goal of newborn health and maternal health. And that existed along a number of other really incredible mobility, but it's those efficiencies and how can we make sure that they're hitting people at the most critical time.
So from the cargo handling industry, one of the key factors is how do you optimize the moves and the product transitions? And I think customary to your discussion is the data that you have from a lot of different companies. You have truckers that are going to deliver or pick up cargo in a terminal. You have cargo coming in on the railroad. You have shippers that are sending from rail to a marine terminal or something like that. And oftentimes the timing of when cargo comes in to a terminal and when it's supposed to go out to a shipping yard is different than when the shipping yard wants to receive it. So the idea of taking all the information that's coming in and organizing it in a fashion that when a product gets picked up, it gets placed in a location where it doesn't have to be multiple times handled by the time it has to leave a facility is critically important. And today, that's the big challenge, is how to mine all that data so you can actively use it for optimization inside the terminals.
What kind of efficiencies are you guys looking at? It seems to me like especially movement of goods, there's a lot of potential bottlenecks, and you guys operate in one of the bottlenecks, right? When a train's free flowing down the rail, it's good. When a truck is on the highway, it's flowing well, great, unless of course on the Kennedy. But it's pinch points like yours that truly can be the, for lack of a better term, I'll use the analogy, you're the pit stop, right? And if you can't get those tires off in that windshield and refueled in, under 4 seconds, no pun intended, you could lose the race. So, for what in numbers though, if you can give us an idea, are we talking about 20%? Are we talking about 10%? Do you think that automating this at its most optimal level, what sort of savings could we see? And by savings, I mean efficiencies that hopefully would be not only making the businesses more profitable, but making goods flow through faster, which increases tax bases, and also potentially lowers the cost, right? Because a lot of the cost is in transit and shipping.
That's a hard number to apply something to because it's constantly changing and you only have control over a certain piece of that. But I think I think it's very optimistically there's a lot that can be gained in that area.
Excellent.
Well, I want to join in on that. The biggest problem with that is that we do have technologies that are able to, our Pathfinder system in which we can automate that. We've had our Pathfinder system has been on the market for 10, 15 years, right?
Right.
A big problem is the culture and dealing with the customers that we have. It's about profits. It's about making sure. So with these systems that we can have, Dan said it was, and I agree with him, it's very difficult to come up with a number. But I think looking at if you removed 3 trucks from the road. I mean, I was counting the trucks as I came in from the south suburbs today. It was a 40-minute drive, but it ended up being an hour and 40 minutes. And being in the intermodal business and seeing that. So, I mean, I think really a big part of it is like having these panels here and being able to reach out to government officials and being able to explain that, and especially with the gentleman like Don, where you're trying to integrate some of this data coming in, because there's a lot of data that we've already been collecting. Dan can tell you, like he says, we have it. It's how do you tie it together? Mm-hmm. But really efficiencies of what if you were able to get trucks to say, you can come into the gate at 2 o'clock in the morning. Yeah. If you're able to spread that vehicle traffic, I mean, I think even the Department of Transportation would be happy about that. I mean, you're not really pounding on the roads. You're not, if you can lessen someone's, I mean, you talk about efficiencies. If you can say, listen, I can save you 20%, you can get to work 20% faster if you live downtown. So, I mean, from a 10,000-foot level, I mean, again, it's really how do we push forward, which I think is why we're here today. I mean, sure. Culture and money.
Say on the
I think that's where the concept of autonomous vehicles helps out. If you look at the industry as it's moving forward and you talk about trucks, I know long-haul trucks are an issue, but short-haul trucks are an issue. And if you can take a distribution center that's going to be built a mile or 2 miles from a container terminal, and you can have autonomous trucks making short hauls to and from those terminals, you can do that at off hours a lot better than you can do it
Yes.
on congested hours and improve efficiencies across the entire industry.
Especially in a town like Chicago.
We may or may not, in the
Right.
Chicago really
Chicagoland
would
area,
be-
have a
would
few
be-
of those.
Yes, I mean,
From the world of, so it's interesting because I've actually lived through this, right, and watched the efficiency number rise in a very controlled environment, right, with an autonomous mining truck that's moving tech, right, it's moving dirt from one location to another, right, you dig it up, you put it in there, you move it from one location to the other, and you've got 60 of these things running around. And over the course of my time with Caterpillar, and this is all public knowledge, right? So I'm not dropping anything out here, but 20% efficiency was gained, right? Once you got through, right, your steps of making it work, right, get it to work well, get it to work safely, and then make it efficient. And that efficiency of 20% gains is huge. And I can see where that could be even more so, amplified whenever you look at an entire city of Chicago and all of the ins and outs in different areas and timing and everything else that happens with that. So once all this data kind of ties together and these vehicles start to come to life and we start deploying them over the next 10, 20, 30 years, we will be able to make massive gains in efficiency, right? We've seen it in smaller areas, and it will absolutely translate very well to the world of autonomy and autonomous logistics.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. Last night at our prep dinner, Cook County Board President Toni Preckwinkle, in her comments, had suggested her concern about automation and mobility after having a conversation with you, Joe.
Nice work.
About her concerns really being about the impact of loss of jobs to a group of working class folks. And we've talked a little bit about it today, truck drivers, heavy machine operators, cab drivers, all of these folks who have embraced the gig economy and are taking on the role of TT&C drivers. And Finch spoke about it as well, to the point that the U.S. government is looking at these job shift studies. But can you guys talk about what you guys see as the job shift? I mean, there's a lot of fear that the jobs that are going to be created are more high-tech jobs and not necessarily working class jobs. I'm not sure I agree with that premise at all, but can you guys talk about sort of your perspectives on that as an organization and how you're looking at and what things you'd like to see from the education sector, from the public sector, as well as what you guys are doing as corporations to help foster that shift that's going to occur?
I think from our side, we're a manufacturer, so what we see happening, yes, we do see some higher tech jobs coming in because from an engineering perspective, there's lots of disciplines from electrical, mechanical, civil, software engineers. All of this requires a lot more engineering expertise in that. But at the same time, hopefully we're increasing our manufacturing assembly personnel because now we're going to have a shift in what we're building and how much we're building and where we're shipping it to, where we're going to build it at. And along with that is service technicians and because if you're not driving and touching the equipment, then you have to be monitoring the equipment and have somebody looking at that data from a remote perspective. So from our side, the jobs are going to shift. You're going to take somebody out of a vehicle, but you'll be employing somebody else to do something to keep that going.
And I agree with Dan 100%. I mean, if anything, you're going to be selling more equipment, which is adding more welding jobs. I mean, we've seen, we developed a brand new crane that was released last year, and we've seen an uptick in our production, and our hiring has gone up significantly. Our jobs are shifting a little bit. I mean, our service tech 35 years ago was a hydraulic, he could, turn nuts, he'd torque, and he would work on a little bit of hydraulics. Now, I mean, as Dan can attest, I mean, these guys are working on mini computers. So, I mean, the service tech, yes, it's more of a white collar job, but he's still driving a truck. He still has a welder on the back of his truck. He has, in some cases, even has a crane. So, I just think the natural progression of even some of what people, the old school blue collar jobs are turning light blue as we speak.
And again, it's
They have to.
As a manufacturer, we're not replacing those people, but what we've done is we've increased our training to personnel. So the same person who can work on the older equipment, who would never thought that he could address a more high-tech piece of equipment, goes through the training programs and is the same guy today that can work on the newer.
We've actually opened a training center and hired several people just because of these new, issues, not issues, but opportunities going forward. So, I mean, there is a cascading effect of this technology.
So, do you know when cars first became a thing a long time ago, if you bought a car, do you know what else you did?
Retired a horse.
Maybe.
You learned
Hired a chauffeur.
Right.
You know why? Cars were deemed too complex and demanding for the average person to operate. But as cars began to gain acceptance, what did the automobile manufacturers do? They made everybody a chauffeur. They made the car easy enough for you and I to actually operate ourselves without having to hire a chauffeur. And so that kind of put 99% of the chauffeurs out of business. And I'm sure at the time that was a tough thing to take. But that's the world. That's the world we live in. The progression of transformation now is going to displace jobs. And the answer is not to say, how do we hang on to it? Let's make coal great again. That's stupid on so many levels. The answer is to say, what does this enable us to do, and where does the opportunity shift? And how do we be proactive in terms of looking forward and leveraging that opportunity instead of being afraid of it? And I think that's what we're going to have to grapple with. So like your training programs, that is spot on. You have to think forward. Every company every board out there is going to do things like, every board will have to have a cyber risk and a climate risk policy just as a form of good governance. There are all kinds of elements of this equation that will open up opportunities. We just have to be smart enough to look forward, understand where those are, instead of trying to hold it at bay, because it's not going to work if we do that.
Yeah, it's this fear-based perspective that, well, jobs will be disappearing, there won't be any more to take their place or something. There's a really great organization here in Chicago, Leave No Veteran Behind, that works with vets and displaced workers and youth actually to learn cybersecurity skills. So I think, to Don's point, certainly just like when elevators came into existence, there were elevator operators. Over the next 20 years, it's not like we're never going to see a rideshare driver in the front seat of the vehicle. It will be a slow evolution. And over the course of that time, hopefully we will regulate the automation and industry to actually have some sort of give back to workforce development programs. Bosch is owned by a charitable foundation simply to make sure that we are reinvesting in the future of a sustainable society. So the kind of STEM or STEAM education programs that we invest in across every single region of the world make sure that at the time that we do have every single product connected and systems like autonomous driving up and running, we have a workforce that has been trained to understand this technology through and through.
I mean, these guys have all said the exact same thing that I've talked about for years, right? And it's the march of technology, it's the march of progress of this world, right? As humans, we evolve and we figure out how do we help, right? Our communities evolve, and I think that's a big role in the world of our, government to help drive that, as well as in the private sector, right? We need to be aware of that and help drive that change in the workforce, because it will happen, and it's going to happen again in the future.
We've heard a couple of times talking about working with your own training centers. Are any of you working with community colleges or local job retraining areas? You talked about the veterans piece, but I believe some of you are working with local community colleges and things like that because I think there's a lack of understanding of what the new job is, right? It's what's going to be needed and the clarity around that. But can you guys talk about that at all?
Well, we're actually starting a program, hopefully first quarter, with South Suburban College. And it's a joint venture for apprenticeship on 5 different types of jobs. Not all of them are super technical, but part of it is with our training center and our technology kind of telling them what we need, and them coming back with the curriculum and the credits that kind of back that up to also enable, people from the community. We're very heavily involved in the community. In fact, I was just at a breakfast yesterday for the Homewood Science Center, which was a STEAM breakfast, because we do invest. We invested with roller coaster activity for 4th and 5th graders in our community. So it's more than just trying to look at business opportunities. It's about being a good citizen. It's about, especially in the Southland. I don't want to make this a Southland speech, but we do want to invest in the areas around us, and we do want to look at education, and we do want to look at technologies and job growth. Just because we're a privately held company doesn't mean we're just out for the profits. But then again, speaking earlier, we do deal with an industry that is very profit-oriented. So, I think it's always juggling those items that become difficult. But yes, working with the local communities. I mean, we've worked with several other colleges. We've really kind of focused in on our local one. But yeah, it's an extremely important part of our business model.
Yeah, I would say that it's a public good, of course, to work with the next generation of innovators, but certainly it's incredible from a business perspective. The work that we do with university students in proof of concept development, in looking at data streams, both public and privately available, to model movement or to look at what solutions development we can create. That when it comes to organizations who are facing budget constraints because you're looking at this forward projection of the future and your revenue is just not where it is today, you cut a lot of those kind of R&D expenditures that don't necessarily contribute to your target bottom line by end of year or end of quarter even. So the kind of scrappiness that R&D takes when you start to engage universities, and we here in Chicago, we have upcoming next month our Urban Mobility Hackathon, where we work with 11 of the different universities and community colleges to have students do not only public and private data set review, but also generate their own data by doing some participatory research where they go out into the world and either survey a corner and how many of this kind of public phenomenon is happening, or survey actual people, and then in 26 hours come up with some sort of business opportunity that they have identified. We're taking a lot of the work that we're doing in universities down to South by Southwest this year and using that pop-up city that is created through South by Southwest as an active test bed for deployment of those solutions. So I think, yes, it's a public good, and I run an organization on the side that works with elementary school kids in this way, but it's great for business and identifying new business opportunity for revenue generation, for sure.
Joe, I'm going to jump just because of time. So we have 3 minutes left, and I want you guys each to be able to answer this question. The next panel is made up of key stakeholders from the public side of this equation. We're the private side. Is there a key question that you'd like to ask the panel if you were the moderator? And it can be, I always say, look at government as not only a policy driver, but they're also, in a lot of cases, an operator and a partner in operation in terms of mobility and transit. So with that, I'll start with Joe.
So in the world of autonomy, right, the thing that I've seen is that whenever you can constrain the environment or provide, helpful technology around the environment, we can drive this technology forward that saves lives. And my challenge, right, or my ask of policymakers would be, what types of things can you do to help drive infrastructure changes, right, in order to ensure that we can drive this technology forward as fast as possible in order to enable the most efficient and the safest systems out there? What could they provide us in terms of, vehicle to infrastructure communication? What can they provide us in terms of lane markings and digital maps and, communication of work zones and things out to these autonomous vehicles? So I guess that would be my primary question, is what are the policymakers doing to help enable this technology?
I guess a question that I have, and Bosch overall, is how do cities envision their role as an operator, and are the systems that they are operating owned by them? Because there are certainly so many different software and hardware solutions, but they're privately owned, and there's a lot of IP reluctance to give up that. So I wonder, is there appetite for third parties managing and operating to create those kind of efficiencies?
Yeah, so we're actually working on, with City Tech Collaborative, working on this project we originally called the West Loop Project, but since it's not going to be located there, we're going to have to find a new name. But it's a living lab of probably 15 to 20 organizations that will run a test bed of public and private entities interacting with one another to try to figure out, what does this heterogeneous world look like? And the question I hope will help try to answer, and what I would ask of the next panel would be to try to understand what's the outlook for how the city infrastructure and policies can be deployed, contemplating a holistic view of both public and private entities that have to work together to make the environment work, to make the environment trusted, to make the environment practical for everybody to take part in.
Just to kind of add to I agree with all of that. But I mean, what I would say would be, how can we streamline communications? How can a private company like ours, that we're not that politically heavily motivated and don't have a lot of those connections, how can we open those conversations quicker and faster?
Yeah, I'd like to look at it from the material handling side, and we're a manufacturer of the material handling equipment, but we work with other companies, again, transportation companies, trucking companies, and several other types of companies that all come together to do one common goal, is to move product on a terminal. And what can be done to assist in getting all of these companies together to look at these technologies and put them to test in a location and help it grow and be accepted more by the operating communities.
Thank you. I think we have the ability to open up for a few questions from the audience of our panel. If you want to just raise your hand if you have a question. Excellent, in the back. I don't know who has there.
Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me. One thing, Joe, that you said was that talked about perceiving the world around you. The vehicles have to do that, and then knowing what's at a site to navigate a site. And I bring that up because one thing that Mr. Fulton brought up earlier was basically that it's important in the testing and ultimately using the vehicles, the infrastructure and the safety. That plays into safety as well. What are the concerns that you have with the current situation of the infrastructure, especially here in the Chicago area? We have some crumbling bridges and some roads that desperately need repair. Thank you.
Sure. So from the autonomous vehicle perspective, at least whenever we look at the world of infrastructure, right, we have a problem to solve. And that problem is to operate in the world that we have today, but try to figure out how we can make it more efficient in the future, right? We understand that infrastructure doesn't change overnight, and we can't completely rely on the deployment of that technology. So a lot of the technology is developed, or there's restraints, right, put around that technology that doesn't allow it to operate in an area where there's excessive potholes, for example. And the challenges in the infrastructure can greatly impact the safety of those systems. Take a good example is the world of the vehicle-to-vehicle communication. We worked with a vehicle-to-vehicle communication provider, and they used our software, right, our platforms, the vehicles that we developed, and they developed a little piece of their software as well, that they were able to perform one of the first autonomous demonstrations in Australia, showing the benefit of that infrastructure and the impact on safety, and that if they can provide the stoplight talking to two different vehicles coming into an intersection at a completely blind corner, without that, you've got some driver who's not paying attention runs straight through, right, a red light, and that's how fatalities happen. In this case, because both of those vehicles were connected and infrastructure was provided, the one vehicle was able to notify the driver in the first demonstration that, hey, that light is red, this vehicle needs to stop, and actually was able to actively stop the vehicle before it got into that intersection. And the other one, the car went straight through, but the autonomous vehicle was able to stop because of that infrastructure. And so in the Chicago area, there's a myriad of problems like that, and that's not specifically here in Chicago, right? That's all over the world. But yeah, very much so, the safety and that infrastructure has to tie together to make these systems even better,
And just to add, it's not just the built world, it's the natural world as well, especially here in Chicago where you have sleet and ice, and the visibility effects on autonomous driving systems are vast. So it's definitely a very regional kind of problem, but similar to other parts of the world.
Do we have any other questions? Down in front here. You got a microphone.
Okay, you've been talking about the autonomous vehicles and the need for data sharing, and that's just sort of that industry. But if that's going to happen, that means, we're talking now about who owns the data again, and how that must have implications for other areas and how we actually do our data sharing and our security overall. Everything's going to shift. What do you have to say about how we deal with that? Because that's not just a private industry issue. It also impacts our government and how they, plan to interact with this whole situation.
Yeah, that's a great question. The question was basically in terms of looking at how do we evolve data ownership and the view of how that impacts what we're doing. And I would say we start by asking the questions, and different companies and different organizations in different cities are taking different approaches, but we haven't gotten to the point where there's reconciliation. So I think there are a couple of considerations, and then I'll add a huge fear on top of this. The considerations are, from an industry standpoint, there are industry consortiums like the Industrial Internet Consortium. There are industry groups like iLava. There are natural facilitators of standards that make sense for people to subscribe to, and that's one mechanism. The other mechanism is the governmental regulatory agencies themselves, which hopefully are or can be aligned with what the industry wants to do. And we have models for this, like in the financial services industry, there's all kinds of, and medical as well. So there needs to be a convergence of industry needs, government and regulatory needs to get some equilibrium, because without that equilibrium, without that sharing, without those standards, our ability to do the things we need to do are going to be inhibited. And the market will need that. Companies will need that to the point where at some point everybody is going to come together. There are two concerns though. Number one, the pace of change is so fast. Do we have the wherewithal within regulatory bodies and within these industry groups to craft the right standards that can be adopted in a time frame that allows us to do what we need to do? The bigger issue is, if that doesn't happen, what's likely to happen is that these standards will be driven by the largest of the large companies. And if hyper-concentration of wealth or hyper-concentration of resources creates instability, and we have 1x data today, 10 years from now we'll have 1,000x data. And if 95% of the 1,000x data is controlled by an oligarch of 9 companies around the world, that is going to create a level of instability on this planet that everybody should be frightened about. So I think that we all should want to see industry groups, regulatory groups, not have such a heavy hand that it squashes what we're doing, but provides a sensible look forward so that we can evolve this in a way that works for everybody. It's a great question.
I think also the next generation, who all has Snapchat and facial recognition and is sharing their location on 15 different apps at the same time, needs to understand the conversation that's being had around data rights and privacy and why that is important, and not just, based around the context of convenience to make sure that their social networking or their ordering of products and goods in the future is easy and convenient for them, but so that they understand the real implications of making that data readily available.
When we opened this panel, we talked about, I mentioned the idea that this is an emotionally charged and filled topic. I think what we've shown here is that this isn't as emotionally charged as it needs to be, and that there are real issues and challenges that we need to overcome, and that it's not necessarily about cars, trucks, or heavy machinery that drives itself, although that's a very kind of really hot and cool thing to think about. That's the bright, shiny penny. What this is really about is collaboration. It's about cooperation in overcoming those burdens together. And we're seeing countries like China do that from the top down. Yeah. We're going to watch Japan in the 2020 Olympics showcase this technology. And that is all done through collaboration by different means. Obviously, China is a very top-down driven organization, but Japan isn't. And I think for us to be successful in the United States and for us in Illinois to be successful in this national ecosystem, it's really going to demand us to help build that system of systems and focus on building that system of systems. So I want to thank each and every one of you for your contributions to the panel, and let's give them a big hand. And hopefully you guys enjoyed the conversation.